We are really happy to have this opportunity to talk about an issue that's very dear to the members of Nodutdol. Nodutdol, for those who don't know, is a progressive organization made up of members of the Korean diaspora in America and allies. And one of the core beliefs of all the members of Nodutdol is the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. And so we put together this teach-in not as experts in policy or as experts in history, but really as people who are engaged in community and activists who are presenting our particular viewpoint onto the current peace talks and issues in the Korean Peninsula. Today, of course, marks the 65th anniversary of the signing of the Korean armistice in July 27th, 1953. Now, the armistice brought a halt to the Korean War, but as we know, in October of 1953, the US and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, entered a mutual defense agreement, breaking the armistice. And to date, there's been no official peace treaty signed between North and South Korea. So the Korean War is technically ongoing. It is an ongoing conflict. The US, of course, still has something like 30,000 troops stationed in South Korea. And so this history, the history of the quote-unquote forgotten war, as it's called in America, the Korean War, is really the crucial backdrop to everything that we'll be discussing tonight. And historical context is very important to Nodutdol in terms of making sense of these current issues. 5 years ago, members of this group and other allies marched on the White House saying 60 years since the armistice was long enough and that it was time to sign a peace treaty. 5 years later, a lot of us were dismayed to hear last year talks of a possible nuclear war. There was some very alarming and disconcerting talk happening from the White House. And so a lot of us, I think, were very gratified and interested and hopeful, tentatively, to see the developments this year. The cooperation between the North and South at the Pyeongchang Olympics. Of course, the historic summit in April between President Moon of South Korea and Kim Jong-Un of North Korea. And of course, the historic summit in June between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, which was the first time a US president has met with the leader of North Korea since the Korean War. So what we're going to do this evening is present, we have 3 volunteers, Betsy representing North Korea, Yujin representing South Korea, and Rose, who will be discussing the US. So this triangle, right, of politics that we're very much engaged in. So how are these governments shaping the narratives back to their own people, right? What are the various media outlets of these nations doing to present the particular narratives of those nations? And what does the government want the people to believe in terms of what's happening with these peace talks?
So my answer will be very short. The state narrative in North Korea is pro-talks, pro-peace, pro-engagement. It is also very strongly pro-reunification and has a very strong narrative of Korea as one nation. Our Nodutdol runs these exposure programs. They're called the Korea Education Exposure Programs, in which we take people in the Korean diaspora to North Korea or South Korea, depending on the year. And based on the trips that have gone to North Korea in the past, the participants have all remarked the strong difference in the way in which the narrative of reunification is very prominent and prevalent in just general North Korean life. And I'll talk a little more about that later.
The reaction from the South Korean media about this peace process has been positive overall and very supportive of Moon's role in it. All the major newspapers published articles about how President Moon's approval rating soared 10% higher to 83% right after the historic Inter-Korea summit. There's been also a shift in the public opinion of Kim Jong-Un. His image has gone from crazy rocket man to reasonable and savvy politician. Even his popularity has surged in polls in South Korea. There is criticism, though, and criticism and skepticism of the talks mostly comes from the conservative media, which isn't a surprise because the conservative media have historically been antagonistic towards North Korea. But even they have been coming around to the idea of peace. They see neoliberal corporate gains in the idea of reunification, such as the possibility of a new market opening up in North Korea, more consumers, access to their abundant natural resources, and a labor force to be tapped. And this is a quote from Lee Jong-Suk, lead researcher at Sejong Research Institute. North Korean labor is just like South Korean labor without unions. Yeah. Speaking of South Korean unions, the conservatism of the mainstream media outlets in South Korea is being challenged internally. Encouraged by Moon's election, the unionized staff of two of the biggest news organizations, NBC and KBS, they went on strike to demand editorial independence and to demand the ouster of conservative appointed leadership. The two previous conservative administrations, the ones of Lee Myung-pak and Park Geun-hye, enjoyed incredible influence on the major news networks. They even handpicked the board members and presidents of these media organizations. Challenging the decade-long conservatism of these networks started actually in the alternative media. Alternative media saw a bloom during the Candlelight Revolution. And some of these, I'll just list a few, are like JTBC and Morning News. They're podcasters and YouTubers like Mangchi Buin and Media Mongu. During the corruption scandal of Park Geun-hye, while the mainstream channels maintained their support of her, and in the beginning, the alternative media were willing to show and say things that the mainstream networks wouldn't. And so during this time of people's awakening, the alternative media gained a lot of viewership. And because the Candlelight Revolution was so massive in scale, even the major networks eventually had to change their tune and become more critical of her and the government. And I'll just tell you a case study of one savvy South Korean media consumer, who's my father, who's a 74-year-old Korean man. So he has like NBC or SBS or KBS on, but with the sound off. And he's got earbuds in, plugged into his iPad, and he's listening to one of these channels, one of these alternative media sources, while reclined in his massage chair as it's rolling and his eyes are closed. So he's savvy, and it just goes to show he's an example of the older generation who are interested in getting their news from other sources now to stay informed. The irony that the peace process is moving forward with Trump's involvement is not lost on South Koreans. But even some South Koreans support the idea of nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize, as laughable as that is. Not in the sense that he deserves it, but that it could be this motivating factor for him to stick to the peace process. So remember, as Betsy said, like the US has reneged on so many agreements historically. When things were moving towards peace, the US has dropped out in these repeatedly. So this is just something that's said in the mainstream about getting him to stick to it. Also, people in South Korea no longer see the US as a generous benefactor, rather that it pursues its own interests. And perhaps this is because of Trump and his behavior. They see that the peace process is a series of negotiations between conflicting national interests. And perhaps this shifting view of the US has also led to the change in popular sentiment in South Korea about North Korea itself. Now, North Korea's past provocations are understood to be bargaining tactics instead of the reckless acts of an unpredictable leader.
As for how the public narrative is being shaped up in the U.S., the dominant corporate U.S. media has focused narrowly on the issue of North Korean human rights, completely failing to recognize how the U.S. investment in ongoing war is also threatening the human rights of Koreans who should be able to live in peace. The U.S. corporate media routinely presents a biased narrative of past negotiations, constantly accusing North Korea of reneging on its promises while failing to acknowledge the U.S. provocations that have influenced the North Korean actions. And I think the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is illustrative here. Generally, the U.S. dominant media focuses on violence committed by Palestinians without any historical context of the larger structural violence of the Israeli state, or a recognition that Israel is a colonial settler state. In general, it needs to be emphasized that there is no depth to mainstream US media coverage. The dominant corporate media fails to provide full context when it comes to reporting on conflicts with North Korea, and the US is never held accountable for its actions.
And our last question, before we open it up to the audience, is how are people on the ground talking about these issues? What's happening in terms of activism, in terms of movement building, in terms of person-to-person discussion and organizing around the peace process?
So as I said earlier, North Korean society is structured very differently from what we are familiar with in the US and South Korea. I'll just share some anecdotes from some of our past KEEP trips, the Korea Education Exposure trips, where we've interacted with North Koreans and been able to talk to people about their thoughts. One, which is just a fun anecdote and just shows the different way in which they view, at least these people that we spoke to viewed society. One of our guides, we were chatting with him and we were like, oh, how did you propose to your wife? And he was like, oh, I proposed to my wife by saying, let's walk the road to revolution together. So that was their romantic proposal. And more relevant to this discussion is in 2013, our two guides we had a young student translator and another young guide, so two young women who accompanied us to the DMZ, which the trip always goes to visit, to see Panmunjom. And they had never been able to visit before, so it was a very impactful experience for them. And along with our participants, everyone sang the song "Korea is One," 조선은 하나다. And by the end, everyone was crying as they looked over at the division. And one of the youth translator said that we shouldn't cry, we shouldn't let them see our tears because then they win, right? So it was an affirming moment in the sense that the division, the sight of the division is something that causes pain and is also something that needs to be ended and fought against. So North Koreans want reunification. Pretty much everyone we speak to want the 우리 민족끼리 version of Korean reunification without U.S. interference. And as some of you may remember, shortly after Trump came into office, he enacted a travel ban to North Korea. So we are currently unable to continue the trips to North Korea, although we recently had our trip to South Korea in November 2017. And so one thing that we do want to focus on is ending the travel ban so as to allow more of this people-to-people engagement and interaction with actual people on the ground, particularly given that the narrative in the US media is either demonizes North Korean people or presents them as helpless victims. And so this is a very important thing that we need to reinstate travel so as to further the peace process.
When South Korean peace activists talk about peace on the peninsula, they mean many things. Not only denuclearization of North Korea, but also denuclearization, the U.S.'s presence, their nuclear presence, the withdrawal of U.S. troops, the repeal of the national security law, which is like South Korea's version of the Patriot Act. And it also means reunification, all of these things. Peace and reunification is understood to be a process to be brought about in stages in order for it to be long-lasting and meaningful. There's kind of two main questions that South Korean grassroots organizers are addressing when it comes to the peace question. The first is how to bring what's currently mainly focused on negotiations which are between state and state level down to the people. How to center and grow the participation of the people within the process. There should be continuous engagement and cooperation between South Korea and North Korea on many levels. And we heard recently that there's plans for a soccer game between members of the labor union in South Korea and workers in North Korea, so things like that. Actually, Koreans aren't new to this idea of a multi-level approach to the engagement and cooperation between countries. From 1998 to 2008, under President Kim Dae-jung and President Roh Moo-hyun, there were many collaborative advancements made. People from the North and South, civil society, they participated in joint research, worker meetings, alternative banking systems, special economic cooperation zones, and inter-Korean railroad projects together. Longtime peace activists in South Korea see that the key to obtaining a true and permanent peace is in ensuring that the engagement between the North and South are people-centered, not state or corporate-centered. The peace process shouldn't be left in the government's hands, is what they're saying. And while most people are content watching the Moon administration make all of the efforts, our ally organizations in South Korea are doing their best to own the peace process as a people's process. The second question sort of that activists are thinking about is how to ensure that a true and permanent peace can be obtained in the long run. And as I said before, the peace process is seen as a series of stages, right? War is embedded in the laws and other systems of current South Korean society and North Korean society. The ultimate goal of the peace process is not simply to sign a treaty and be done with it. Rather, the treaty is the beginning of a systemic change, and hopefully a new paradigm of peace in Korea can take hold. So because of the fact that South Korea, the state itself developed under wartime conditions, and there's no peace treaty yet, all institutions, the state, like the military, education, legal systems, they're still based on this notion that North Korea is an enemy and that they're at war. So any peace process would have to fundamentally change those structures.
Okay, as for how the U.S. public is dealing with the peace process, it's been often noted that Americans have a limited interest in foreign affairs, and that seems much to be the case here. As time has passed since the summit, public interest seems to be fading in this issue. Among the left, there appear to be so many crises going on, whether ICE detentions and family separations or police and anti-Black violence, that it's challenging to focus issue on the Korean peace process. Within the Korean diaspora, there are mixed emotions, hope and excitement, as well as anxiety and skepticism. So it seems for the left and for the anti-war movement, this is really a critical opportunity. There needs to be a challenge to the narratives that are being constructed in Washington and by the US corporate media. Activists need to focus on ending the Korean War as soon as possible, even before denuclearization, and we need to work to educate the public on Korea, to connect the situation there to larger issues of U.S. militarism, and to apply pressure to the U.S. government.
And I just want to mention again that what we wanted to do with this teach-in, with this presentation, was really just to begin the conversation. Obviously, we couldn't cover 70 years of history or even the intricacies of the peace process. Okay, our first question is, and if you need a post-it, please raise your hand and we'll get you one. Our first question is Kim Jong-un willing to give up nuclear weapons without withdrawal of US forces as a precondition? What are North Korea's objectives? Objectives. Can North Korea's objectives be achieved without the withdrawal of US troops?
Kim Jong-il has stated in the past that it's not necessary. I think at this point the state is saying that they are willing to consider the presence of US troops. However, I would think that if the US maintained its nuclear armed, ships and things like that in South Korea, that might be problematic. Jung-Un, do you have any additional comments?
So I think the issue, this question should be understood as a part of what Yujin said as a process. So do they really agree that US troops will be permanently staying? That I'm not sure. And then no one will be so sure about that. However, at the time of denuclearization, do we think that US is ready to leave? That really depends on, the right answer maybe depends on the political circumstances, the synergy of the different states. It depends on so many things, logically speaking. So we cannot determine, the North Korea cannot say, as an ultimate goal versus as a process and traditional goal that may be different. I think that's what we should keep in mind is that North Korea is also flexible in terms of their strategy in getting to the permanent peace.
Our next question is, how will South Korea, and I think this means the South Korean government, combat its youth's decreasing support for reunification? So, how will the South Korean government deal with the youth's decreasing support for reunification?
I think the question is about the young people in South Korea are not as interested in reunification as their older counterparts. Actually, recently we saw a presentation in which a noted Korean author Kim Dong-chun spoke on this subject, and I think he also had difficulty with this question. My answer is I'm not sure how the South Korean government, but I think the question of youth engagement and reunification is a question for the left movement in South Korea, not necessarily the government. I think that will also be what mobilizing the youth in South Korea by leftist forces will also help to ensure a peace process that is more just than relying on the state to, motivate young people to care about reunification. But I think also as it becomes something that might be more tangible, it will become something that more people will be interested in. The possibility in South Korea often has seemed very remote and now not very present in everyday life.
I'm not sure that that's necessarily true though. The youth in South Korea are not interested. I have read things that perhaps they don't have this strong feeling of like a family connection and as much of the they've inherited the trauma, but they don't have a direct link to the trauma of the division. There's things like, I don't know if these are things that maybe the left will do, but for the very young, like things like being able to travel to this place that's their neighbor that they haven't been able to see, and meet their counterparts. Again, part of the people-to-people process of like perhaps bringing children together from the north and the south and getting them re-engaged, and also I think a part of the sort of systemic change that South Korean activists are looking for, which is changing the education. Like one of the sort of notion that they're at war is embedded into very early learning, and if that in itself is also shifted, then we can get a younger generation to be interested in reunification.
I mean, I just want to say one more thing on top of what Yujin said is that the result of the disinterest of the youth may be a result of the education during the 9 years. Because a lot of times when you hear about the reunification under the Park Geun-hye and Lee Myung-bak, the conservative administration, it was all about the economy. Economically, how much of tax that South Korea has to pay for, how uncommon or unequal the economic development or economic status is, so that it will be burdensome to the South Koreans. And as a young people who was looking for an employment and already having a hard time looking for a job, in terms of you are thinking about all these people who are going to be unemployed together, the reunification does not make any sense to you anymore. So then, it's not beneficial to you. And that's the propaganda of the media that made them think that this is not good for them, or this is not good for you, so you should not be really supporting. So if we think of that, then maybe the change the media and change the education will have a more balanced view on what's the benefit and what's the loss, what's the stake and what's going to be gained. Then maybe we will have a better, different youth that, after the 10 years later.
You're going to be sitting down here.
And then we're going to look at that one.
Come closer. I'm not sure.
Julia, come down there. Not really, but I don't think it's possible.
Yeah, come in more.
Hey, Eugene. Eugene. I'm no photographer.
NJT, what are you doing out there?
Trying to take a take about 10 minutes.
Today,
It'll take a long time plus.
today.
Come, JT. Okay.
Today.
Stay. Don't move. This is panorama.
Yeah, panorama. Okay.
Thank